Hi, everybody. Welcome to Alternative Frequency, and I am here with a local artist, Debra Krakow. Deborah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am a Kingston artist. Actually, I live on Wolf Island.
Oh, cool.
And I have a show on now at Studio 22, which I guess is what you're wanting to hear about. So the show is called Horizons, and this is my latest series of paintings. They're large, abstract landscapes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, when is the show going to be taking place, and where could someone go to see it?
Well, Studio 22 it's one of Kingston's little hidden gems. I think you can walk right by it and not notice because it's up on the second floor, 320 King Street East. So it's facing Market Square, right above Coffee Eco and Morrison's. The show opened this week, so it's running until May 15th.
Awesome. And about how long did it take you to work on this show and get all the paintings ready and stuff?
Well, surprisingly, because this is my biggest show I've ever done, not that long. I have 25 paintings in the show, and like I said, they're large. Some of them are 5 and 6 feet wide. And this is all work done since September.
Oh, wow.
So it's been a pretty intense period of studio activity.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of, so you mentioned they're large, abstract landscapes. Could you maybe talk about a few paintings specifically?
Well, some are more abstract than others, but the theme is basically, the idea is they're abstract. Some of them you would look at them and you would say, okay, that's a seascape or that's a field and a sky. Others, much less so, and everybody might read their own thing into them. But the thing that I find really fascinating is you can start a completely non-objective painting, and as soon as you put the hint of a horizon line in, people see a landscape in it. And so I've kind of been playing with that idea and making them big so that when you stand in front of the painting, for the bigger ones, it encompasses your whole field of vision. So you really have that sense that your wall just becomes a horizon and you're immersed in this landscape. So that's sort of what I was experimenting with and playing with in this series. I've come around to this. I used to do actual landscape painting, mostly in watercolor, and I did that for years. And then I kind of moved into acrylics and started to do completely non-objective painting, meaning, when you say abstract, you're really talking about taking a real thing and then abstracting it. So you're making it less exactly like it really looks, whereas non-objective is not identifiable as a thing at all. So these paintings kind of bridge the gap. They're out of my head, and yet they really, I think, borrow from that long period of landscape painting that I did.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And what kind of made you develop this idea?
It's challenging when you do non-objective painting to know where to start. I mean, a canvas can be a bit daunting when you leave it completely wide open. You don't have a subject matter in front of you. You kind of put some paint down, and that sort of informs your next brush stroke. But it's pretty daunting, and I really like the idea of just having in the back of my mind that these were going to develop into landscapes, and it really gave me a focus, and I think that's why I was able to produce the series so quickly, because I really had this this focus that somewhere in the painting would be a horizon line, and it all kind of went from there.
So it kind of sounds like it was produced naturally, just as you were going almost.
Yeah, I don't usually plan my paintings. Usually I'll spend a long time planning my color palette, and I might spend an hour just mixing up paint, because you need a lot of paint when you're painting these big paintings. So I'll pre-mix a lot of color until I have a palette that I find really exciting to look at. And I might start out with a concept in my mind of how the painting's going to look, but it rarely stays there. So usually I'll start with the canvas on the floor, and the great thing about having an art studio is you can get paint all over your floor. So I will literally start pouring the paint on, and I'll usually start with really big tools. So I've got 10-inch wide paintbrushes.
Oh,
and
wow.
I've got scrapers, and I sometimes get right in there with my hands, and I'm pouring water on the canvas, and so very loose and free and extremely messy, and I'm walking all around it. And when I get it to a point where it's starting to speak to me and do something interesting, I usually just let it dry, and then I'll put it up on the easel. And then it becomes much more kind of slow and contemplative, and I'm standing back and looking at it, figuring out what it needs. Smaller brushes, which are still relatively big. I don't often go to anything smaller than a 2-inch paintbrush. But that's kind of how they develop. So it's a pretty unplanned, kind of spontaneous process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just before the interview, when we talk, this isn't what you do for a living, right? You work as an architect.
Yes.
So how do you kind of balance your work and this art that you're doing? Because you seem to do it rather intensively.
Yeah, I do. Well, I mean, there's sort of two questions there. And one is managing time and energy, which is, I do work full time. My background is architecture. I actually do project management for the city of Kingston, which, is a pretty demanding job. So, yeah, you get home and you're tired. But once I've got momentum on a series of paintings, I just want to be in my studio. So I can actually kind of muster the energy for a second shift, evenings, weekends. But I think the other thing that's interesting about what you're asking is how does the architectural background tie in? And I think really a painting is a design exercise. Ultimately what makes a good painting is the composition, which is another word for design. So I think that background is really, really useful, actually.
And I'm also curious about, is your way you're painting, it's this very like free kind of, almost improvised method of doing so. And have you did you paint in different ways before? Like how has your painting changed, developed?
No, I did paint very differently before. I started, actually, when I was in School of Architecture, we had a really good life drawing teacher. We did life drawing every week, and so really learned the fundamentals of drawing, and then we did sketching. And from there, I got into doing watercolors, and my watercolors kind of started fairly loose, but over the years, I guess as I became more adept at the medium and was able to control it, the paintings became more and more controlled. Which was great in a way, but it wasn't really what I wanted to be doing. And I got to a point where I wanted to be a little more creative and experimental, and I was really admiring abstract work that I was seeing. But that's a tough transition to make when you've been painting very realistically, to jump into doing abstract work. So it actually kind of took a few years to make that jump, and a few good teachers helped along the way, watching how other people work. But yeah, you really do have to kind of approach it as an experiment. Sometimes I think of my studio as a lab, because the other thing that I found really interesting is with watercolor, the medium has a kind of inherent beauty, and that's why people are drawn to it. Like you can just splash some paint on a piece of paper and it looks gorgeous. You don't really get that with acrylic. Acrylic is plastic, and it comes out of the pot looking not that interesting, And so I experiment a lot with texture and how I can layer the paints. And in any given painting, I'll have some paint that's really thick and some paint that's really thin. And sometimes I'll throw other things in there like pumice or gel mediums. So yeah, it's a real kind of like process of experimenting and discovery, and things don't always work. So there's, and that's interesting too, because sometimes a painting will just work like first shot, and that's great. And you think, wow, I better not tell anybody how easy that was, or they'll never want to spend any money on it. But those don't actually happen that often. And I started to realize after a while, when they don't work out first try, I end up putting another layer and another layer. And, and each time you're letting a bit of the layer underneath come through. And I started to realize that those paintings that I struggled over and that had many, many layers were actually the best paintings in the end, because you look at the canvas and there's this kind of mystery of, you can tell there's stuff underneath, but you can't see it all, and it's very evocative. And once I made that discovery, it really kind of made me feel a lot freer in my work, because I realized there's no harm if the first few layers aren't working that well. In the end, it's just going to make a richer painting. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It kind of has that history behind it almost.
Yeah, you get a lot of texture and you get bits of color coming through. And,
I've done a little bit of acting in my day, like drama stuff, and something that my teacher always said was like, any creative success is built on a mountain of failures.
Yeah,
And
I think that's true.
Yeah.
You know, and after a while, you don't think of it as failure. You
No.
just think of it as, you know, a step along the way. You know, I had to do that in order to realize it wasn't going to work. And
it's a process of trial and error.
yeah.
In your newest series, what are some like highlights in it? Like some of your favorite pieces that you did?
Yeah, I do have a few favorite pieces. I'm always a bit reluctant to say which they are because if someone else walks in and has other favorites, I don't want to, you know, diminish their thinking. There's a couple sort of mini series within the bigger series. So I did. There's 3 paintings of forests, and those are the only ones where the horizon theme is less strong because there's probably a bit of a horizon there, but there's the feeling of being in a forest. The lighting is really different in all 3. But those were really fun to do, and I like those a lot. And then there's a couple that are very large, that are 6 feet wide. And like I said, I really love those because it's like having a window on the wall. Like you really feel that expansive space. And I think people are drawn to expansive spaces like that. And I see that from my studio window. I'm up on the 3rd floor, and I see fields, and I can see the seaway. So I think that kind of comes into the paintings. So those would probably be my favorites. The other thing I did in this series, which is new for me, is some of the paintings have very vibrant color, like bright turquoise and bright orange. And that's kind of new for me. I've tended to use more muted color palettes, so I'm kind of excited about those just because I look at them and I think, hey, I would not have done that a couple of years ago. So, yeah.
What made you kind of do that shift toward the brighter colors?
I think it's a combination of things. Last year, I spent 6 months in the south of India with my family.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and wow, there is so much more color there. I mean, people wear bright colors. The women especially wear really bright colors, and you know, it's warm weather, and it's stunning. I mean, just the visual overload that you get there. And I guess I you know, we got back in February, which is probably the most monochromatic time of year here.
Yeah.
And so it really got me thinking about bright color. And yeah, anyway, so I think that was one of the influences, probably not the only influence. I look at a lot of artwork. You know, I go to art shows whenever I can, and I look at a lot of artwork on the internet. And when I like a painting, I start to collect them in a file, and I start to think about, oh, what is it about these paintings I like? And, you know, started to realize, well, I do like some of the ones that have really bright colors, so I should be doing that.
Is there any kind of, like, main theme or something you're trying to communicate with your work? Like, what's, like, the cohesive, like, thread throughout them all? Is it that horizon line, or is it something else?
Yeah, you know, I chose the title Horizons for the series, and the word kind of has 2 meanings, and one is the very literal meaning, you know, where the earth meets the sky. The other one is more like the limit of your perceptions, you know, when people talk about broadening their horizons. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that idea of just exposing people to more art. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, I don't know anything about art or whatever. And I wanted to do a series that was very approachable for people who might have only thought they like landscape painting and maybe don't really appreciate abstract art. But I think these paintings could help people to sort of bridge that gap for themselves and start to kind of open their horizons in terms of their art appreciation. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty awesome. And something else that I'm just curious about more about your background in art. Have you just always been interested in this, or has your passion for painting kind of developed over the years?
Well, it has developed. I was kind of torn when I went into architecture. I really loved art, and I also was really drawn to the sciences, and it seemed like a good compromise. And I knew that at McGill, which is where I went, that there was a really good art teacher, and that was emphasized as part of the program at McGill. As soon as I graduated, I started taking evening courses, summer workshops in art, and I did various kinds of printmaking, sculpture, fiber art, all kinds of ceramics, all kinds of different things to kind of give myself that really broad background. So yeah, it's been a developing interest for a long time.
All right. This is just about all the time we have for today. Is there any final comments you'd like to make, or just one more little plug?
Well, I guess just to encourage people to come and see the show. And if you've never been to Studio 22, it's a beautiful space. Don't be intimidated. Just go up that stair and walk in. And the show's on till May 15th.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.